Good evening. Thank you for being here this evening. We've got some good things we want to share with you and the gospel. Paul said that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. He also said he wasn't ashamed of the gospel. And the lack of shame that Paul had for the gospel sometimes is interpreted a little bit different in the church community that I grew up in. And when we always talked about not being ashamed of the gospel. We always told people, well, if you're out on the street and you're ashamed to go up and tell somebody Jesus loves them, or if you're in an airplane and you got a captive audience and you can't stand up and preach to everybody, then you're ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, most people wind up being ashamed of those people who do that, actually, getting in a little bit of a weird situation. I remember being down in Oklahoma and having the street preachers there. If anybody's been down in Oklahoma, and all the Bible school students that go to school there, one of the requirements from a lot of the Tulsa and Oklahoma City Bible schools, one of their requirements is street preaching. And I remember driving through the intersections there in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, and it was amazing to pull up at a traffic light, and the moment the light turned red, there was somebody standing there in the median, flipped open his Bible, and he preached all the way through his doctrine, led people to confess Jesus as their Lord, led them into the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, and led them to a full commitment to ministry, all before the next traffic light changed. And they had it down to a science, and then the next group would come along, and that was his job to continue. But when Paul was saying that he wasn't ashamed of the gospel, you have to look at it in the context of Paul's life and what type of contradiction that the gospel was under. You see, in Paul's lifetime, after his conversion, he was living, of course, he was a Jew. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and he knew the law very well, and he preached the law. We have to realize that society was dominated at that time by Judaism. It's kind of like the atmosphere even in our country right now, where the larger part, not nearly to the degree to where that Paul's world was ruled by Judaism, ours is ruled by Christianity. And there's standards and things that people just kind of expect, that if you have a different opinion that contradicts the evangelical Christian atmosphere that we're in, it's like you almost have to kind of be undercover and under wrap about that. But in Paul's time, the thing that he was not ashamed of was, based on his teaching, was to believe, teach, and accept and express the fact that he was righteous strictly without his works, and that his righteousness being completely and only by what the work of Jesus had done. Now, to not claim to have righteousness based on your works, that was something that Paul said, for me to tell you that I am righteous without my works, in his particular society he was living in, that would have been a shameful thing for them to get up and say. But he said, I really don't care what anybody says. I am righteous by the work of the cross, and that is the only righteousness that I have. Back when I first started teaching, I had, and this has been 30 years ago, actually 34 years ago. That's amazing. I was only, what did I have to be then? 5 when I started or something? But back 34 years ago, when all of this began for me, this was my mindset that I was brought into to find stability was that there was a good God and a bad devil. And, I couldn't make any sense out of life. And I was trained kind of in the Baptist persuasion, which believed that everything that happened was God, whether it was bad, if you got sick, it was God. And if you, whatever happened, good, bad, ugly, and different, it was all in the church that I was raised in. It was all the work of God, that God was doing something in your life. So when I latched into the doctrine that I did, at least there was a comparison that separated those two. And I remember so clearly in my understanding of what the gospel was at that time. And I remember so clearly describing to people, I have a line. They want to know, how do you speak with such clarity? And I told them, I said, because I have a line right here in front of me that's drawn just right straight down the middle, and there's a line this way. And everything that's good that happens to me is under this category, and it says God or Jesus. And everything that's bad that happens to me is under this category, and it's called the devil. Now, that was a radical departure from my Baptist roots, but at least it gave me a comparative way of looking at things. One thing that you're going to find when you begin to study something comparatively is it's going to bring a relative degree of peace. Because comparative teaching and comparative understanding is the means by which we find something that resolves these issues, instead of just staying absolutely confused about it and wondering what's going on, why is this happening? Now, but we have to understand that just because somebody tells us this is why this is happening and this is why that is not happening, it doesn't mean that it's the truth. It simply gives definition to the experiences that we're having. Now, we've all experienced that. One of them I call a doctrine of convenience. And of course, I have to speak to you from my experiences. And I've pastored churches. I've spoken all over the world. And in our attempt to try to do this God-devil thing, it was just amazing. Because in my attempt to tell people what was going on, we would explain to them that whenever, especially like in ministry and in the other churches that I was in, it was amazing that if the people in the congregation had problems and there was things happening and, their finances weren't good, or they were going through a rough time, or there was trouble in the family, from the pulpit of the churches that I was around, the clear definition was that because there was sin in your life, the devil was getting in and wreaking havoc in your life. Now, I don't know how many of you went through that or felt that concept that the reason this tragedy happened is because there's some sin in my life somewhere. Now, a doctrine of convenience, though, is that you can take that same doctrine for the minister and his family and his staff, and when there's the same havoc that breaks out in the pastor's family or the leadership's family, it is amazing how that suddenly the resolve about what is taking place changes. Because now it's not the devil is attacking them because they equally have sin in their lives. The devil is attacking, but it's because they are so much in the work of God. The devil's trying to stop them from all their wonderful deeds. The devil's attacking you because of all your bad deeds, and the devil's attacking us in leadership because all of our good deeds. That's one thing I call a doctrine of convenience. It's convenient to point out that it's fault on your part. But do you see that by comparison, when you have faulty comparisons, you're going to come up with faulty results? Now, when I was comparing everything that happened in my life based on it's either God or it's the devil, it's God or it's the devil, that put me in great conflict in life. Now, at first, I'll tell you, from where I was, it brought a degree of peace. It gave me something to kind of rely on. But just because you begin to rely on something does not mean it's reliable in the long run. Mm-hmm. We have all started in a position of belief, and it was so empowering to us. It like, oh my God, now I understand. But how many of you have gone through that point that same understanding turned around to be your greatest torment? Yeah. Yep. Because it didn't work in the application that you needed it in at some other point in life. As I've studied like a lot of you have, and come to conclusions. And one of the things that has become extremely vital to me is that I do believe that there is a proper comparison. Paul's teaching was by comparison and therefore had a great deal of revelation in it. But again, you see, if you don't compare the proper things to the things that they should be compared to, there is no way that you can come up with with an accurate result. It's kind of like as you get into something, a discussion with somebody, and they're trying to prove their point, and they start making this comparison, and you'll hear people say, well, you're not comparing apples to apples. Mm-hmm. It's not a proper comparison. So you see, it's very valid to challenge the comparison that is being brought up. Now, the main thing about this is this goes all the way back to the fact that Adam partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, it was a major transition for a lot of people when I began to point out that if the tree was called the knowledge of good and evil and it caused the whole human race to fall, whatever that definition means to you at this point, but obviously something drastic happened after that. But the fact of it is that the fall included just as much good as it did evil. So you see, suddenly this tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not something we were supposed to split the fruit into and get the good out of the fruit and throw away the evil, because the entire fruit was a part of the fall. So the knowledge of good was as much of a fall as of the fall of man as the knowledge of evil. Can you see that? Because it was all one fruit. It didn't say, okay, now if you pick the ones on the right side of the tree, that's the fruit of good, and the fruit on the other side of the tree, that is the fruit of evil, and I only want you to pick the good fruit. But he very emphatically said, do not partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When man did that, that put man on his own path to try to discern and figure out what that was. And then all of the false comparisons, all the miscomparisons, the faulty comparisons that man tried so hard to gain some type of understanding of life. Now, as things have cascaded down through the years, we have an Old Testament that covers some 4,000 years of the history of mankind, and Moses and the giving of the law, and the Isaiah and the prophets, and all of these things. And then, of course, we have the presentation of Jesus Christ into the scene, who I believe is the Son of God, who I believe was born of a virgin, who I believe died on the cross for the sin of the whole world, who I believe was raised from the dead and is seated at the right hand of the throne of the Father. These are things that I embrace, and I actually think that I understand why they're vitally important. And I think I know why that they had to be done that way. But these are things that we glean from proper comparisons. Now, the other issue that we began to deal with as we came through this by feeding off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as we dealt with righteousness, we were actually dealing with either righteousness or unrighteousness, right? Now, is that a proper comparison to try to find the clarity of truth? Well, again, all we're doing is splitting the apple down the middle. The apple, which we call it an apple, let's say the fruit that we know that the entire fruit was part of man's fall. How can we extract the good out of what was part of the fall and wind up with something that's going to be life everlasting for us? You can't extract the good out of that which was forbidden and leave the evil and think that we're going to wind up with something better than what Adam had in the first place. The wonderful thing about it is that there was a tree that started all of this mess, and there was a tree that ended it. Mm-hmm. The tree that Adam partook of, and then the tree that Jesus nailed all of this stuff to the cross. And that's where that a clear, very, very clear comparison came And we're going to look at some of those things in this session tonight. A very, very clear comparison that this is not a comparison when you're trying to gain understanding of life. The true comparison is not between the righteous and the unrighteous, but the true comparison is between the righteous and the self-righteous. And when we see the impact, number one, we need to see where self-righteousness comes from. We also need to understand where righteousness comes from. And then as we look at these two forms of righteousness, each one of them has a fruit. Each one of them has a quality that comes from them, a mindset, a psyche, an entire way of viewing things from the difference between the issue of self-righteousness and that of righteousness. And to start out, as far as the text is concerned, I want to start out in Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. We're going to see some things tonight, even